I work at a low-key diner in a small town, the kind of place that serves grease-drenched fries and all-day breakfast, where regulars come to sip overly sweetened coffee and swap gossip that echoes off the chipped linoleum. It was a job that I took out of necessity more than passion, especially since my mom had just recently fallen sick, and I had all the bills piling up at home. My coworker, Karen, is the kind of person who thrives on petty drama. She's got a knack for turning mundane requests into full-blown crises. She's also been eyeing my Wednesday morning shift, my only early day, like a hawk, but I'd made plans to take my mom to her bi-weekly therapy session, a rare opportunity for us to reconnect, as my work schedule often monopolized my life. It was during one of her endless complaints about her own commitments that she launched into a full-on crusade, convinced that I, the selfish employee, was sabotaging her chances for success. I politely declined when she first asked to swap shifts, citing my prior obligation, but that only seemed to snowball into her relentless barrage of guilt trips and passive-aggressive remarks. "You don't care about anyone but yourself," she huffed one night during closing, flicking the fryer switch off with far too much force. "Some people have real ambitions." I tried to shake off her words, but they clung to me like sweat-soaked uniforms. I thought maybe I was being unreasonable, and since people love to insist that kindness is a two-way street, I made the mistake of texting her one evening to see if we could reach some understanding, joking that I could trade my early shift for her Saturday night, which is the busiest time at the diner, hoping this would make her think twice. But Karen was relentless. She acted like I'd committed treason. Soon I was receiving messages from other co-workers, who were also under her spell, asking me why I couldn't just be a team player, to do it for the family of the diner. It started to feel like a witch hunt, but I stood firm. I couldn't lose my one chance to spend quality time with my mom. The weight of my decision hit harder one night when I overheard Karen talking in the break room, plotting ways to undermine my credibility. She painted me as the villain to anyone who'd listen, saying I was sabotaging her dreams while simultaneously tearing down my work ethic like I was the problem ruining her life. I couldn't comprehend how a simple shift swap had turned into something so twisted. Was I really the antagonist here? A part of me thought about just giving in, but the memory of my mom's face during our last appointment reminded me of what I was fighting for. A tiny but fierce part of me didn't want to grant Karen the satisfaction of having made me yield. As weeks dragged on, I noticed strange things happening. Orders would come in for tables I wasn't assigned, the ice machine would mysteriously malfunction, and patrons oohed over the burnt toast that I'd swore I never cooked. It got to a point where I almost felt like I was being bullied at my own job, a chilling sensation creeping over me that Karen had somehow turned the rest of the staff against me. One particularly chaotic Saturday, I was hit with the nausea-inducing news from my boss that I would need to take a 2-week indefinite leave due to additional training. It was a thinly veiled excuse, but I heard the laughter in Karen's eyes when I left the break room. With my heart racing, I pulled up the diner's group chat later that night, only to see Karen had shared a meme about a greedy coworker that looked suspiciously like me. The blind rage surged within me because I was sick of her games, but it wasn't until the night of my mom's treatment that everything spun out of control. Sitting in the waiting room, I suddenly received a frantic text from my coworker Sarah, warning me that Karen had taken my shift, and I knew she'd done it just to make a point. Panic gripped me, an icy hand squeezing my insides as I reflected on how low she would sink just to win a petty fight. I rushed back to the diner, yelling at the owner, but he was too mesmerized by Karen's shining performance behind the counter. I left, heartbroken and nauseated, feeling trapped in a web of everyone else's delusions. But it was that anger that eventually propelled me forward. I swore I would no longer allow anyone to dictate how I conducted my life. So with a heavy heart, I made a plan. I kept my mom's treatment notes clutched to my chest, carefully documenting every absurdity about the diner and getting to know my coworkers better. The next time I stepped in that diner, I was armed not just with memories, but intent and vengeance. It was no longer about the shift, it had morphed into a catalyst to take down a toxic work environment once and for all. As the weeks passed, I slowly began gathering support, showing my colleagues the truth behind Karen's facade, and it wasn't long before the memes and whispers flipped on her. The tides turned swiftly. She was out of the restaurant and back to being the messy, bitter person she had always been, while I finally reclaimed my time with my mom. I may have felt guilt at first for refusing to give in, but sometimes putting yourself first is the only way to stop a bigger issue. It was the hardest battle I had gone through yet, but I emerged victorious, with lessons learned, with scars that whispered reminders that no matter how vitriolic the world becomes, integrity always matters more. After all, being a team player doesn't mean losing yourself in someone else's game. I never thought a simple decision about Christmas morning would spiral into something that felt like a living nightmare, but here we are. My husband and I had always imagined our children waking up to a sea of colorful wrapping paper, their laughter and innocence filling the air like the smell of fresh pine from our tree. So, when my husband's parents were insistent about joining us to watch our kids open their gifts, I hesitated, not because I didn't want them there, but because of the dark, quiet secrets that always seemed to surface whenever I spent time with them. See, my in-laws have this unsettling ability to twist every joyful occasion into an underlying tension, an atmosphere thick enough to cut with a knife. The first Christmas we spent together, they arrived early, their smiles stretched too wide, their eyes too focused on my every move as I tried to set the scene of holiday cheer, and I remember my daughter's joyous squeal being overshadowed by a comment from my mother-in-law about how children shouldn't be spoiled with so much. That experience pushed me to set boundaries, and I was firm this year. I want this to be a special moment just for us, I told my husband, who reluctantly agreed, aware of the strange weight our in-laws carried in our lives, almost like a curse that cast shadows over even the happiest days. But then Christmas morning arrived, and my excitement quickly turned into dread when I saw a text from my mother-in-law at 5 a.m., saying she couldn't wait to see them, her unwavering enthusiasm creeping under my skin like ice. I tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered like a storm cloud as I sipped my coffee, the aroma mingling with the unmistakable scent of impending chaos. I insisted to my husband that the whole family could come over later, after the presents, but he had that look, one of silent defiance, as if stepping into the battlefield to protect what little peace we had left. As the hour approached for the kids to wake, I went into survival mode, meticulously hand-picking the ornaments our daughter had decorated the night before, but the glee in my heart felt hollow. The little ones bounded in, their eyes sparkling brighter than any Christmas light, and I could almost forget the impending doom at my back, that is, until the doorbell rang just when they were about to dive into the pile of gifts. I froze, breath hitching in my throat. My husband shot me a panicked look, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I could only imagine who stood on the other side. Sure enough, there they were, my in-laws, faces beaming, clutching bags filled with their own presents, as if it were theirs to share. My body reacted instinctively. I stepped in front of the kids as if I could shield them from this intruding wave, all my intentions to keep Christmas pure unraveling before my eyes. We agreed, I stuttered, my voice barely a whisper but sharp enough for them to hear. We wanted today just for our family. For a brief moment, there was silence, and I could see my father-in-law's smile falter, flickering like a muted TV screen in a dark room, but then my mother-in-law's expression twisted, and it made me physically recoil. "Sweetheart," she said in that deceptively soft tone that made my skin crawl, "you don't want to spoil the holiday spirit, do you?" My husband stepped up to diffuse the tension, but a knot tightened in the pit of my stomach, and before I knew it, I was leading the children upstairs, almost dragging them from the scene that morphed into an argument between my husband and his parents, a battle of wills that would shatter the already fragile thread of our Christmas. I tucked the kids under my arms like precious jewels, whispering to them that everything would be okay, but their wide eyes mirrored the confusion I felt too. I could almost hear my own heart pounding above the muffled shouts from downstairs, like a metronome marking the passage of time, and despite knowing we were safe up there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was brewing just out of sight. When I heard silence settle like dust in the aftermath of their words, I finally ventured down the hallway, only to witness the scene of my husband sitting on the couch, face pale, looking utterly broken as his parents stood above him, faces still twisted with that disconcerting blend of disappointment and determination to claim their power. "I can't believe you'd deny your children this happiness," my mother-in-law hissed. My mind spiraled, torn between wanting to run back upstairs and wanting to protect my husband from this mental assault, but when I stepped into the room, all eyes turned to me, and I instantly regretted it. "Look what you're doing to him," I shouted before thinking, and my voice echoed like a bell in a deserted abbey, cutting their glares into shards that sliced at the very fabric of our family. My husband's eyes flickered to me with a strange mixture of shame and longing, the pleading look in them begging me to stop, but there was no stopping it now. The moment had escalated into chaos, civil war waged over the rights to Christmas morning, and I felt the darkness closing in around us, a smothering shroud threatening to choke the life out of my children's excitement. I couldn't take it, couldn't breathe in that suffocating atmosphere filled with resentment, and I grabbed my kids, ushering them back upstairs, with a scream trapped in my throat. My heart pounded as our little family barricaded ourselves in, the noise of their increasingly furious voices fading into the background until all I could hear was the sound of my children's confused whispers. I tried to reassure them with soft words, but how could I explain the evils that lurked outside that door? My husband joined us moments later, yet the defeat on his face was a mirror reflecting the horrible reality. This year's Christmas was shattered, our joy stolen, and as he pulled us together, it felt like a fragile house of cards, just waiting for one more gust of wind to take it down. Hours passed, my stomach twisted in knots while the sun crept into the sky, illuminating the shadows of our crumbling home until finally, we heard the door slam. A rush of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived when my husband dared to open the door. When he peeked out, I quickly felt something dark brewing in his gaze, the kind that made my heart sink into my stomach. He turned to me, eyes glazed with disbelief, and whispered, "They're gone." The heaviness in the air was almost tangible, and I knew, in that instant, that things would never be the same. We came together, holding our children close, but the feeling of dread never left. How could we ever celebrate Christmas the same? Each year afterwards became a reminder of that singular moment, wrestling against the ropes of doubt and discontent that our own families tied around us, leaving my husband and I in a constant battle to keep our children's innocence untarnished while the darkness of anger and grief loomed just beyond the walls. I realized with a sinking heart that Christmas wasn't merely a day, it became a symbol, a battleground in my mind, a reminder that in-laws could bring a darkness unlike any other, slowly creeping in like a thief of joy, and whether it was worth the cost of keeping them away on that one single day would haunt me for the years to come. I am writing this because if I don't, the memory will consume me. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and for almost half my life, I've harbored a secret that has haunted me since childhood, a secret that recently spilled out and shattered my younger brother's perception of his most cherished memory. 14 years ago, we spent an idyllic summer at our family's lake cabin, where the highlight was a photo of my 6-year-old brother, Daniel, catching his first fish. In that moment, he beamed with an ear-to-ear grin, the sun reflecting off the lake's surface, framing him in what seemed like pure magic. But the truth? That photo was a lie. I'd photoshopped the image to replace a snapshot of him in tears, furious at not being able to haul in the fish I'd caught earlier. I did it to preserve not just his childhood pride but my own. I wanted to be the perfect big sister, the one who always made things better. For years, I let him believe he was a fishing prodigy, a glorious little angler destined for greatness, and I felt like I was doing right by him. However, guilt festered in me, a festering wound pretending to be a scar, and as life would have it, I plotted my confession, trying to plan it in the least destructive way. Yet, the worst time came a few nights ago when Daniel, now a confident 20-year-old with dreams of being a marine biologist, wanted to use that photograph for a presentation on childhood memories. That's when the truth slipped from my mouth like a dark shadow breaking free, the realization that my brother's most treasured moment was nothing more than a fabrication. I watched the joy in his eyes fade until they were eclipsed by confusion and betrayal. I initially thought admitting it meant I'd cleanse my conscience, but it only unleashed a raging storm in him, a tempest of hurt and anger that left him reeling. I thought he'd laugh it off, surely he wouldn't hold it against me. But as I witnessed disbelief morphing slowly into hurt, it dawned on me that I had stripped him of a part of his innocence, weaponized what was supposed to be a simple memory, turning it into a cruel joke that twisted his childhood in ways I never anticipated. "Why would you do that?" he demanded, his voice barely cracking but laced with a boiling fury that felt alien yet terrifyingly real. "It was my moment. You took that from me, and for what? A stupid story?" The pain in his voice cut deeper than any blade, and I crumbled. I never expected to feel this insignificance take root in me, as if I had turned back time and was faced with an immense weight of responsibility. I tried to explain my motives, how I thought I was protecting him, yet my words felt hollow against the backdrop of his devastated expression. That night, he walked out, leaving me alone in that cabin, its walls suddenly closing in on me, each of our shared memories mocking me with their cheerful nostalgia while I was engulfed in darkness. I spent the following hours replays in my mind. What if I'd told him earlier? What if I'd let him have those painful moments? I kept him safe, but I'd kept him small, shrunk him into this tiny box of falsehoods, and now he wouldn't speak to me. I tossed and turned until dawn, visions of my brother's face swirling, the hurt, confusion, and disgust straining and pulling within me. As I watched the first light of morning creep through the curtains, I made a decision. I needed to do more than just apologize. I needed to show him the truth behind the photo, the real memories, the harshness of life that accompanied growing up. That's when I turned to the internet, diving into every forum, every advice column I could find on how to mend the rifts in family dynamics, how to deal with guilt when it's intertwined with love. It was then that I stumbled onto something strange, a post titled "Twisted Memories, What Would You Do?" The comments flooded my vision, ranging from empathy to outright hostility. It was as if the world had taken their collective traumas and laid them bare for the sake of my enlightenment. Each tale was unique yet framed by a common theme, the struggle of truth versus illusion. Among them, a single comment stood out, a user claiming to have once erased a sibling's memory too. She wrote of a photograph that had twisted a sibling's childhood with dark magic. At first, it seemed absurd, but the more I read, the more I felt a chill creeping down my spine. The user shared that after years of sharing fabricated stories, the guilt manifested as something more sinister. She claimed that reality had warped around her lie, that she began to see glimpses of future memories that became nightmares, shadows that crawled into existence, feeding off the deception. As I read the comment, my heart started to race. I didn't want to spiral, but how could I ignore the uncanny parallels to my life? I decided that if Daniel wouldn't come back to me, I needed to find my own path through the chaos of guilt. I returned to the cabin, armed with the intent to face this truth head-on, and there I felt the weight of those walls close in on me once again, my own memories whispering doubts and fears. I pulled out my phone, wanting to salvage what remained of our bond, and scrolled through old pictures, each swipe sending jolts of nostalgia through me, reminding me of the little boy who had looked up to me for everything. When I stumbled upon the photo in question, there it was, the fake image that haunts me now, the one that ripped away Daniel's childhood dream like a thief in the night. But instead of just darkness, a flicker of something else caught my attention. In one corner of the picture, hidden in the shadows, a figure stood barely visible, unusually distorted, as if it were a reflection of something highly malevolent, its fingers stretched, reaching toward Daniel, the fish eerily vibrant yet dead in his innocent grasp. My heart raced. The comment I had dismissed now felt like a warning. I was about to delete the image, when the memory of that summer clamped down harder than ever. The shadows of our childhood somehow now felt as if they'd been alive all along. The fish, once a token of triumph, now felt like a whisper of something sinister, a memory turned into a potential nightmare, a cycle I had started. Suddenly, the cabin ambience shifted, it felt oppressive, and the air thickened with unshakable dread as I glanced towards the window where a chill breeze swept through, chilling the hair on my arms. There, lurking in the shadows where I'd once seen joy, I perceived movement, just a flicker, but enough to send a cold tremor up my spine. I raced outside, desperate to make sense of what I cropped out all those years ago, hoping to recover the essence of that moment and shield my brother from the darkness that might have crept within our lives through my deceit. What if, in the echoes of my defense, I had unleashed something more sinister, something festering all those years, waiting for the right moment to strike? I took a deep breath as I faced the lake, where sunlight danced innocently across the surface, but the memory of that photo lingered like a stain. I vowed to Daniel that I would rectify this mistake. It wouldn't matter how awful the truth was, it needed to be told. As I plunged into the water, each stroke burned with purpose, with the resolve to collect remnants of the past, to confront whatever shadows had twisted our truth. It took 2 agonizing hours, the sun slipping down the horizon by the time I emerged victorious. I held a rusted fishing lure in my grasp, the very one I recalled tossing in frustration during that summer. As everything fell into place in my mind, I felt a chill run through me, not at the lure but at how dark and twisted my path had become. When I finally returned to shore, I felt different, lighter, yet the shadows lingered, as if darkness intertwined with my essence. As I faced the cabin, knowing I had to confront Daniel, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The shadows seemed to stir, almost mocking me. But I made my way back to the cabin, with each step weighted by that rusty lure, hoping with every part of me to reconcile this burden of childhood illusions before it engulfed us both. And there I found him on the porch, lost in thought, vulnerable, shattered, and staring aimlessly at the fading light. "Daniel," I started, but the tremble in my voice echoed doubts that swirled in the still air. Would my truth be enough? Would it even matter? I hugged the lure to my chest, and as darkness fell around us, I took another step, knowing I still had my own damning shadows to face, a tale woven together by our secrets. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where I'd have to confront my boyfriend's aunt over a Coachella ticket, but here I am, sitting on this dingy couch, heart racing as the realization of what just transpired washes over me like a tidal wave. It all started innocently enough. My boyfriend, Jake, had promised me a magical weekend filled with music, friends, and memories after saving up for months to attend the festival, and when I casually mentioned that I'd be bringing my best friend Sarah along too, Jake's excitement turned into something else entirely. He had a pretty big family, and while I loved spending time with them, his Aunt Linda was a piece of work, horribly intrusive and always looking for ways to reap the benefits of being part of the family. So when she sidled up to me at dinner last week, flashing her overly bright smile and the glimmer of something sinister in her eyes, I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Oh, sweetie, how nice for you to go to Coachella. I'd love to see what all the fuss is about," she cooed, her voice dripped with mock sincerity. I didn't think much of it at first, but that Saturday morning when I reached for my ticket to send to Sarah, my stomach dropped. It was gone. I frantically searched every corner of my room, thinking I'd simply misplaced it, but deep down, I knew. I could feel her eyes watching me during dinner, lingering a little longer when she asked, and I gleefully explained how I'd managed to snag a ticket against the odds. It felt awful admitting it to Jake, but he was just as angry as I was. He assured me we'd confront her together. So, the following Sunday, after pacing back and forth, rehearsing a dozen ways to address the theft, we finally knocked on her door. I mean, I never wanted to escalate the situation, but when she opened the door in her threadbare pajamas, looking more disheveled than usual, and when I said, "Aunt Linda, we need to talk about the ticket," her expression shifted from surprise to amusement, and then to smugness, like she held all the cards in this game that I barely understood. "Oh sweetheart, did you really think you'd get away with that? A Coachella ticket? You should have known I'd take it. It's nothing personal, it's just business," she said matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing the weather. An icy pit formed in my stomach as the earlier thrill of my impending trip dissipated into sheer disbelief. "You can't be serious. You're stealing from your own family." "That's messed up," I managed to choke out, but she waved her hand dismissively, her laughter echoing in that cramped entryway. That's when I snapped. "I could call the cops on you, Linda. Stealing a ticket is still a crime," I spat, regretting my harsh tone a moment later, but the truth hung in the air, and I could tell it hit her harder than I expected. The lightheartedness faded as something darker tightened around her eyes, and for a brief moment, it felt as if shadows shifted within her soul, revealing fractured intentions. "You really want to take this higher?" she asked, amusement gone, replaced by a low, chill-inducing whisper. My palms became clammy. I hadn't actually wanted to threaten her or anything, but there was something twisted about the way she responded, like she was unbothered and yet simmering beneath the surface. Without waiting for my reply, she slammed the door shut, leaving Jake and me standing there in utter disbelief. The drive home was numbingly silent, but the tension hung between us like a potential storm on the horizon. A week passed and our Coachella dreams began to fade into bitter memories, and that's when I received a text, "I hope you're ready for me to spoil your weekend." I felt a wave of anger mixed with dread as I read the message again. Who the hell did she think she was? Jake urged me to let it go, saying it wasn't worth the trouble, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Aunt Linda was more than just a quirky family member with questionable morals. The night before we were set to leave, I couldn't sleep. The thought of stepping into a festival atmosphere while knowing she might be lurking around transformed my excitement into anxiety. I smashed my phone down when another notification lit up, followed by a loud, menacing snicker cascading from the darkness outside my window. A memory flickered to life, the way that Linda gazed at me, almost as if she enjoyed my discomfort. That very night, Sarah, who had driven in from out of town, texted that she was running late due to roadwork, and in no time, Jake and I were ready to go, practically bouncing off the walls despite the aura of dread contradicting our enthusiasm. The sun beat down mercilessly as we drove to the venue, the vibe electric with anticipation, yet I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Glancing around, jitters coursed through me until we finally parked and made our way through the crowd, the bass vibrating beneath our feet, the air thick with the sweet aroma of festival food and excitement. Music filled the air as we found our place among friends, but as the first band took the stage, I felt someone watching me from the edge of the crowd. My heart raced as I turned. There, mingling with festival goers, was Aunt Linda, looking as innocent as ever, rocking her signature flower crown. Panic clouded my mind. Did she come to ruin my experience, or was it some twisted intervention? I nudged Jake and pointed. "What the hell is she doing here?" He turned sharply. "Give it a rest, she's probably just enjoying herself," but I wasn't convinced. I spent the next few sets watching her from afar, and the longer I stared, the more she appeared to embody this harbinger of chaos, weaving through groups of people and then disappearing into the crowd. It was only during the third set that everything escalated. Sarah and I were dancing, lost in the rhythms, but suddenly I felt a hand grab my shoulder, yanking me back. I spun around, ready for a confrontation, when I came face to face with Linda, her eyes glinting with something dark, her mouth twisted in a strange smile. "You didn't think you'd get here unscathed, did you?" She sneered, her voice a sickly sweet whisper. My stomach dropped as Jake rushed to my side, anger flaring in his chest, but before he could say anything, she leaned in closer, her breath cold against my ear and said, "You should have kept your mouth shut, honey, you have no idea who you're dealing with. This is my playground." Then she slipped into the crowd, leaving us stunned, my heart racing in my chest. I felt sick. Who was this woman that she turned a simple estrangement into something so sinister? I wanted to enjoy this festival more than anything, but the gnawing sense of danger lingered like a shadow, overshadowing even the brightest moments. The night stretched on, and hours passed, filled with intoxicating music and laughter tinged with anxiety until finally, just when I thought I could breathe easy again, I turned and spotted Linda once more, lurking, but this time she was speaking to a group of security guards. Fear coursed through me. There was no doubt in my mind this woman was plotting something malicious. Within moments, murmurs began spreading through the crowd, and then chaos erupted. Someone had punched one of the security guards, and as bodies began to flee, I saw Jake look toward me, panic etched across his face. "We have to go now," he yelled, and we made a run for it along with hundreds of others, the bliss of the festival engulfed by sheer terror. I glanced back and saw Linda, somehow reveling in the pandemonium she'd unleashed, and it hit me, the ticket, the threat, the laughter, they'd all been part of some twisted game she played, and now I was a player in her insane reality. As we slipped past the barriers and swarmed into the parking lot, the echoes of sirens neared with each step. "Where did she go?" I gasped, searching the crowd, but my entire body screamed that this wasn't over. We piled into the car, and although Jake fumbled with keys, I stared into the chaos we'd just escaped. "Aunt Linda's insane," I breathed. He nodded, eyes fixed on the growing crowd around us. Just when we thought we'd slipped away, my phone buzzed again with a text, "You can't escape me. I'll find you, sweetheart." That night, every ounce of excitement was completely drained from me, and as we sat parked outside our apartment, I realized this Coachella trip had turned into a nightmare filled with threats woven into memories, and Aunt Linda was only the beginning. I never thought I'd say this, but I might actually have to call the cops. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, the kind that felt ripped straight from the pages of a dystopian novel, marred with shades of gray and uncertainty, and the darkness that lurked just out of sight. My daughter, Hannah, has always danced on the edges of life, a brilliant but misunderstood 15-year-old laboring under the weight of what I thought was autism, her unique quirks, the way she'd chatter about dinosaurs to anyone who would listen, her anxiety sudden like whispers in the wind. My heart broke for her in the cruel world of teenagers, and I encouraged her to embrace her differences, to find beauty in her peculiarities. So, when I overheard her mention her autism to her friends in what I thought was a proudly defensive way, a cute little quirk she believed made her special, my gut clenched with an unsettling tightness. Inviting them over for a study session seemed harmless enough, but when I saw the way they wrapped around her, smothering her with assurances, it drove something chaotic and protective in me to burst out. I never meant for it to escalate, but suddenly I was standing in front of them, my voice defeating the friendly laughter and chatter, declaring that she wasn't autistic. The room thickened with discomfort, and I could see Hannah's face twist into the kind of hurt that sends an icy hand straight through a parent's heart, her friends looking between us like toddlers caught in a watered-down horror movie. The air crackled with something unnameable, and I could see it all unravel, how I had gotten it wrong, or maybe the world had twisted it, maybe I was condemning her to confusion, gaslighting her to fit my expectations, but each word tumbled out of my mouth against the creeping, gnawing terror misfiring in my brain. What if I was wrong? My daughter shrank into herself, her friends standing like frozen statues as I mentally backpedaled, desperately searching for words that could unring the bell of my rash outburst. I tried to explain, autism had never been verified, we had gone through evaluations, and I thought we were just on the edge of understanding her better. I pleaded with the space to breathe again, yet Hannah had already darted past me, eyes filled with something frighteningly close to betrayal, into the upturned laughter of her friends. I could hear the mumbles beneath the laughter, "She can't even own her truth, maybe she is just weird," and the guilt sank in deeper than any regret I'd ever felt. Was I trying to protect her from the label, or was I just afraid of what that label might mean for me? As I stood there with my words hanging like a noose, I could feel the dread creep in like a fog, thickening with every second as I recalled darker days, missing the boundary of her laughter where I thought she was comfortable with her identity. I tried to grasp for a semblance of control over the chaos spinning into reality. Panic bubbled in my throat. I wanted to run after her, hold her, explain that I'd love her no matter what, but my phone buzzing in my pocket reminded me there are always consequences to every action. The school counselor calling, each ring a reminder piercing through me. If only I had the words that day, maybe she wouldn't have bolted outside, and maybe the shadows I feared wouldn't have been stirred up at all. The call didn't land fortuitously, it landed like a slap, announcing a meeting that I was supposed to attend to address the teacher's concerns about the transition Hannah was undergoing, entering high school, and the interactions it birthed. I paced the dim hall of our home, anxiety wrapping around my thoughts like a chokehold. I knew what they were going to say: potential loss of funding for her IEP, the looming sense of suspicion that somehow I was mishandling this brilliant, fragile creature. Hours passed, and dread infused my silence, until finally, I heard her voice wavering outside, moments before her friends were to leave, their chatter growing distant, and then silence settled like a stone. I couldn't bear the thought of facing her unprepared, my mind a storm, the aftermath of my reckless act sitting between us. I walked tentatively to her room, where the door lay ajar, shadows dancing eerily under the flickering light of her desk lamp. She was sitting against her wall, tablet in hand, lost in the glare of the screen, a world far removed from me. "You don't understand anything," she shouted when the door creaked open, resentment wrapped around her words so tightly I felt it brush against my skin. You just want to fit me in a box." I tried to engage her, to tell her what I felt in the pit of my heart, that I was trying to protect her, to shield her from a world that could be unnervingly cruel. But words only poured out, like tongues of fire, igniting our conversation into a full-blown war of truths, half-truths, and fear, all wrapped around the question that haunted us: AITA for trying to define her existence based on something I had convinced myself to believe was in her best interest? As I listened to her cry, feeling that empty sentiment seeping into every crack of my resolve, I realized it wasn't merely the labels but the isolation we both hungered to escape. We were spiraling into a chasm, too deep for either of us to grab hold of the edge. Time blurred until it felt distorted, like watching a movie play out on a wall with others looking in, and in those frantic minutes, I lost sight of how to untangle the lie I'd created over fear, how to repair a fracture that threatened to turn my sweet daughter into someone unrecognizable. Our truths collided violently, and despair coiled tight around my chest until clarity hit harder than any revelation I had ever known. The only way out of this was through her, through listening and understanding, no matter how terrifying that felt, no matter the shockwaves that would ripple through my own perception of her identity. So I knelt on the floor beside her, fingers trembling like my resolve, and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Hannah. I want to understand you. I want you to know you're perfect just the way you are, no labels, just you. Please help me." But even as I said those words, I could feel shadows swirling in the corners of my mind. What if the thing I feared most had already begun to deposit itself into the very fabric of our lives? What if this small fracture between us was just the start of something darker to come? As peripheries blurred and fear turned to ice, loneliness stretched unrelentingly, and I held my breath, hoping that this time, it would heal rather than destroy us. I had always been a proud, open-minded person, but the moment my husband suggested hosting his niece and her friends for a weekend, my heart sank into my stomach like a stone. "They're just kids," he said when I expressed my discomfort. "It'll be fun." I smiled weakly, but a knot twisted in my gut as I remembered the incidents that had taken place in our small town recently, reports of children disappearing, strange eyes watching from the shadows, whispers that drifted across the playground late at night. It wasn't the kids themselves I disliked, it was the haunting feeling that something was terribly wrong. The first night they arrived, laughter filled our home, but it was an eerie kind of laughter, one that clawed at my insides. The kids immediately started playing hide and seek, but not under the usual terms. They seemed to forget the boundaries, darting into rooms we hadn't even entered yet, giggling and peeking out like they knew secrets we didn't. I felt like a ghost in my own house, stuck in a nightmare where I was simultaneously an unwilling host and an invisible observer. When they invited me to join their game, my skin prickled. I declined, saying I had work to do, but that only seemed to amuse them more. Their eyes glinted in the soft glow of the living room lamp, and every time they glanced my way, it felt as if they were sharing silent jokes I wasn't privy to, a joke at my expense. As night fell and I tried to tuck myself into bed, the sounds of their whispers drifted through the cracked walls of our old house. I could have sworn I heard my name amidst their giggles, calling me out as if it was a part of their secret game. The next day, I decided to take a bold step and talk to my husband, laying out my worries, hoping he would see the truth of the situation. "I just don't feel comfortable with them here, not with everything going on," I admitted, my heart racing as I spoke. He frowned, looking hurt, and I instantly regretted my honesty. "So you're saying our niece and her friends are a danger?" His voice was low and sharp like ice. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words felt too large for reality. He turned away, dismissing my fears as improbable paranoia. "You're overreacting," he said, and I knew that our disagreement would hang over us like a dark avalanche waiting to fall. Throughout the day, I became more determined to keep an eye on the children. I watched them from down the hall as they congregated around the dining room table, shadows flickering across their excited faces. They moved in coordinated precision, sharing odd words in a language I couldn't understand. Each time I stepped closer, they'd hush immediately, their eyes locking onto me with a strange intensity, as if I was intruding on something sacred. That night, I lay in bed, too restless to sleep, replaying my husband's skeptical reaction. Was I really being paranoid? The thought twisted my gut. I tried to focus on anything but the gnawing sensation lingering in my mind, but then a soft tapping snagged my attention. I swung my legs around and crept to the doorway. Peering into the darkened hallway, I felt the icy fingers of dread wrap around my spine. It was just past midnight, and the house was eerily silent except for the faint sound of laughter drifting in from the living room. Curiosity washed over me, enough to nudge my feet forward. I crept toward the voices, heart pounding, and when I reached the dining room, my heart nearly stopped. The children were gathered in a tight circle around something. What were they doing? I squinted, trying to see past their small, interlocked bodies. Suddenly, one of the boys glanced over his shoulder, catching my eye. An unsettling grin spread across his face, and he beckoned me closer. "Come join us," he chirped. Instinctively, I felt the air grow thick, pressing down on me like a heavy weight. "No," I called out, my voice trembling. "What are you doing?" A round of giggles erupted, and the girl standing in the center lifted something high above her head, something glinting in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was a stuffed animal, but it wasn't just any stuffed animal. Its fur was soaked, dripping an unnatural shade of red that pooled onto the floor. "Look!" another child exclaimed, excitedly pointing at the gory toy. "It's alive!" My heart raced, and panic surged through my veins as I stumbled backward. They were all looking at me now, their expressions shifting from giddy playfulness to something dark, something twisted. The insistent tapping of their fists against the table echoed in the stillness, a morbid rhythm that sent chills shooting down my spine. "Wanna play?" the girl asked, her voice now too sweet, almost mocking. I turned and ran back to my room, locking the door, pressing my back against it as if it could shield me from whatever vile magic those children possessed. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, but in the morning, the unease returned tenfold. As the sun rose, I slammed coffee into my system and finally confronted my husband again. "You need to see what they're doing. They're playing with something." "Wrong." His eyes narrowed in disbelief, but before he could respond, a raucous series of knocks shattered the morning calm. The children were outside, slamming their palms against the door, yelling my name, their voices rising to a pitch that felt like nails scraping against my skull. I opened the door to reveal them standing in a line, beaming smiles painted across their faces like they were in on a joke I wasn't. "We want to play," they chanted in unison, their voices ringing like a nauseating choir. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and before I could reply, the boy in front pulled something from his pocket. It was a tattered piece of paper, and as he unfolded it, I recognized it all too well. "It's your name," he said, and my pulse quickened. It was an article written about the missing children of our town, my name marked at the bottom in a clumsy scrawl along with several others. "Join us in our secret, and you'll never want to leave," the girl chimed, and the invitation felt like a tether dragging me into an abyss. I slammed the door in their faces, trembling with anger and fear. My husband stormed in at that moment, demanding to know what was happening. I had never seen his face twisted with such concern. "Are you finally going to believe me?" I shouted, but he shook his head, his belief in me dwindling away like autumn leaves. I barricaded myself in our bedroom, praying, clutching my phone with trembling fingers, ready to call for help if it came to that, but I knew deep down that no one would believe me. The whispering began again, the shadows seemed to stretch further as I huddled against the closet door. Time blurred, and I didn't know how long I stayed there, locked in a never-ending spiral of fear, until I finally plucked up the courage to peek through the slightly ajar door. But the moment I did, an icy hand gripped my wrist, and those kids were there, back in my face, their smiles now wide and predatory, and they shifted like a sudden gust of wind as though they could melt right through the door. "You shouldn't have locked us out," the boy said, his voice echoing like distant thunder, and the last thing I remembered was screaming as the world crumbled into darkness around me, my consciousness slipping away as they slowly pulled me into their game. AITA for admitting I was uncomfortable. I now wondered, my voice echoing in the void, for there was no one left to hear me. I've always been protective of my belongings, especially my expensive headphones. They were a gift from my grandfather before he passed, and they're not just headphones, they're a piece of my history, my sanctuary. Living in a small, cramped apartment with my roommate, Jenna, had its challenges, especially when it came to boundaries. Jenna was charming in her own right, a free spirit, a whirlwind of messy hair and bright laughter that could fill a room, but she also had a way of pushing my limits, always borrowing things without asking and then somehow convincing me it was totally okay. A few months ago, she borrowed my headphones for the first time, saying her own had broken, and though I had reservations, I couldn't say no when she gave me that pleading look. But when I noticed the small scratches on the ear pads upon their return, my stomach twisted with a mixture of anger and sadness. It felt like she was borrowing not just my headphones but part of my soul, and every damage was a betrayal. Weeks passed, and I resolved to keep the headphones locked up whenever I left the apartment, but last Friday, she approached me with her typical sunny smile, asking to borrow them just for a quick session. I hesitated, feeling that familiar unease wash over me. "Please, just for a couple of hours. I promise I'll be super careful." But recalling the state they had returned in last time, I couldn't help but instinctively shake my head. The conversation escalated. She accused me of being selfish and paranoid, and while she ranted, I felt my heart race, my mind racing as I tried to explain the value of that gift, but my words fell upon deaf ears. It spiraled into a shouting match, and I was ready to slam the door against her face just to feel vindicated for standing my ground. But when night fell and I thought I would have the space to breathe, something felt off. As I lay in bed, the silence of the apartment grew oppressive, and a creeping sense of dread settled over me. The moment I heard the unmistakable click of the door opening, my heart stopped. I glanced at my phone, 2:13 a.m. I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but the soft sound of something sliding against the hardwood floor got louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of my headphones being moved. I shot out of bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Peeking around the corner into the dimly lit living room, I saw Jenna hunched over my desk, glancing back nervously, her fingers intertwined with the cords of my headphones, the terrible glint of defiance in her eyes. "I know you're up." "It's just a pair of headphones," she hissed, her tone laced with an eerie calmness that sent chills down my spine. I could have chosen to scream, to lash out or call her out, but something deep within me made me instinctively choose a cold silence, watching eerily as she continued to act like a thief in the night. An unsettling rush washed over me. I knew then that this wasn't about the headphones, this was a battle of wills, and I had no intention of losing. "You think I'm just going to let you take them?" I finally managed to whisper, breaking our shared silence, my voice low enough to shake among the shadows. The moment stretched into an eternity as her eyes widened in surprise, but then, to my horror, a sinister smile crept across her face, as though she relished being challenged. "You need to lighten up, you really do," she said, her voice becoming mocking, each word dripping with disdain. "The world won't end if you just let go a little." I felt a fire spark in my chest, booting my fight or flight instincts into high gear, as I stepped out into the living room, the shadows closing in around me like a predator ready to pounce. "You're not taking them from me, Jenna," I said, now resolute. Her confusion morphed into anger, and in return, I felt an unnatural strength overcome me. It was almost like I was possessed by a vengeful spirit teaching me the gravity of self-defense. Just as she reached for the headphones, I lunged, gripping her wrist tightly as I felt the aura shift between us, transforming the air into ice. After a tense grapple, she finally shoved me away, stumbling back, and in that moment, something terrifying happened. The lights flickered, casting a creepy shadow against the walls, dancing as if mirroring our turmoil. "You don't understand what you're asking for," she whispered, her voice suddenly trembling. "You don't know what happens when you refuse someone something they want." The atmosphere became thick with unsung words. My pulse quickened, every rational thought screaming for me to vacate the situation, but I was locked in, eyes wide as Jenna approached me, menacingly, almost hypnotically. "You think this was just about the headphones? You're clueless, and now," she leaned closer until I could smell her panic and desperation, "now you're in the way." Before I could react, the faint blare of my headphones crackled to life, pulling me out of her chaotic hold. Colors swirled as if the universe had reset. I closed my eyes, feeling the world spin, a haunting whisper flooding my senses, "You should have let me borrow them." As the sound overtook me, I realized too late that I had not only lost my headphones but perhaps something far more precious, my peace of mind. I bolted from the apartment, not daring to look back, propelling me through the night air and into the unknown, knowing I could never step foot back in there again. Because sometimes, the people we trust the most harbor darkness just waiting for the slightest chance to uncover itself, and sometimes, in refusing something that feels insignificant, you find that you've awakened something truly terrifying lurking just beneath the surface. I never thought I'd have to justify teaching my daughter the importance of sleep, but the day I found myself sprawled across the living room floor, heart racing and eyes wide open, was when I realized everyone views the world through their own lens, even my 8-year-old. It started innocently enough. Mia was a bright, curious kid who preferred late-night readathons over the weaknesses of sleep. She'd marathon Magic Tree House stories until the early morning hours, and it didn't help that her school started later in the day. I was worried, of course, but I never thought her nightly habit could twist into something darker until I started seeing the whispered shadows creeping around our home late at night, at first, mere figments of my imagination, a trick of the moonlight. But soon, I began to hear them too, soft whispers in the dark, grating against my sanity like nails on a chalkboard. They'd slither around my ears and seep into my dreams, taunting me with secrets that rattled my bones. I tried talking to Mia about how her late-night escapades were weaving a web of sleeplessness, but how could I compete with the enchanting stories she conjured in her imagination? One evening, desperate for a solution, I devised a plan. I would create a reward system for her to go to bed on time, embellishing it with the promise of being more energized and focused during the day. I thought I had struck gold when she eagerly agreed, all while those shadows shrieked in amusement, relishing in my naivete. The first few nights were a struggle as Mia cried for her books, but eventually, she started accepting her new bedtime. It all peaked when I noticed the whispers still darting around me, telling me it was too late to reverse everything, that maybe I should let her stay awake so they could find her, an absurd thought that sent a wave of anxiety crashing over me. One night, the tension reached its breaking point. I had just finished reading to her instead of the usual bedtime story. It was a thrilling old fairy tale, a diversion from my own creeping dread, almost lulling me into a trance as I tucked her in. But as I did, I saw the shadows cast onto her wall, impossibly long and grotesque, almost resembling hands trying to grab her. It was ridiculous, terrifying even, yet mesmerizing. My heart pounded in rhythm to the whispers, the urgency palpable in the air. "She must stay awake, join us," they seemed to chant. I flipped on the nightlight, banishing the darkness to its corners, and she squeaked out a frightened "Daddy, are they coming for me?" My laughter cut through the air, a desperate attempt to cloak what I felt was creeping closer, but there was no hiding my terror from her wide, unsettling eyes. I spent the night monitoring her, a pit of dread building as I realized the whispers had become frantic, feverishly relentless, urging me to let my daughter know she was safe, but I felt increasingly uncertain of my own sanity. That was my breaking point, and in an act of desperation, I whisked her away and enrolled her in a sleep training program I had read about online. They said it would teach her both the importance of sleep and ensure restful nights. But the horrified look in Mia's eyes, begging me not to leave her during our first session, tore me apart. Yet I pressed on, my mind firmly convinced it was for her own good, for a small sense of normalcy. Sessions churned into weeks, and while Mia took her lessons to heart, I was left spiraling deeper into sleepless desperation. Each night felt longer, and the whispers invested more time in raking my mind over the coals of dread. "She doesn't need you, she'll choose to join us soon." It haunted my dreams, transforming her laughter into disturbing echoes as I tossed and turned in worry. I desperately reached out to other parents, but in our social media group, my pleas were met with laughter. "Come on, it's just sleep. You are not being called to join the Sandman," they chuckled, but each laugh cut deeper until their amusement morphed into derision. Before long, they had tagged me as the overprotective dad who couldn't let go, further isolating me. I deployed strategies I'd learned in my own sleep-deprived state, led by what they advised rather than what felt right. I pushed her limits, enforced rules, and even barricaded her bedroom door with pillows, a move that causes waves of shame to ripple through me now. That night, the shadows slipped under her door, engulfing my household, murmuring vehemently, and I swear I could see them reaching for her. Tina, my wife, had long since given up. To her, Mia's sleep rebellion had graduated into another anecdote from a baffling father. I could hear her whisper late at night, "You're being overbearing," but every absence of sleep kept straining at my desperation. One fateful evening, the whispers crescendoed, echoing through the walls, and in a moment of sheer terror, I rushed into Mia's bedroom. The room was dim, illuminated by the pale glow of the moon spilling through her window, and there was Mia, soundlessly sleeping, but the voices screamed louder, almost erupting from the very corners of the room. "She must choose, she must choose." In an act of panic and fear, I picked her up, shaking her awake, shouted for her to get up. "It's important she stays alert," but my wide-eyed daughter crumpled in protest, her face stricken with fear. I was thrust into the horror unfolding before me. The shadows coiled tighter around me as I cradled her, horrified at how they began to flicker in the corner of my vision. They wanted her. In an all-consuming frenzy, I dropped her back on her bed and slammed the door shut, gasping for breath as if I had disrupted an ancient ritual. Had I doomed us both? The next morning was met with a silence that pinched my conscience, and when I approached Mia's room, I found it empty. My heart plummeted, 1,000 terrified thoughts racing through my mind. I dashed through the house, frantically searching, but the only noise that greeted me was the echo of my breath against the walls. It was then that I remembered the voices saying they would wait. Her door creaked open, and I felt their presence encircle me, still lingering like an unshakable chill. I tore back to where the shadows had taken me, and my hands fumbled to pull open the old closet door, revealing only impenetrable darkness, and there was Mia, but caught in a trance, a pitiful expression on her face. I would pay any price to pull her from that abyss, back into my arms where she belonged. When she returned to me moments later, her eyes focused once more, I held back my tears. It was all my fault. I had taken away the only shield she had against the shadows, her bedtime stories that filled our lives with imagination and warmth. As I cradled her, I made a decision. I would let her have her stories once more, even if it meant I could never truly sleep again. The importance of sleep suddenly became the echoes that trailed behind us, a gentle reminder of what dreams truly held. Though I still yearn for quiet nights, I realize the cost of my lessons was far too high. Am I the jerk for trying to teach my daughter the importance of sleep, or have I simply opened a door I can never close again? I never thought I would reach the point where I had to cut my sister out of our weekly family dinners, but the moment she showed up with her son, Ethan, wearing a shirt that read "I don't care" and a scowl that could melt ice, I knew this was going to be different. Each week it had turned into a circus act, with Ethan running wild, climbing on furniture, and hollering about how everyone else was boring, while my sister, Lisa, just sat there scrolling through her phone, occasionally muttering half-hearted attempts to curb his antics. My parents would smile awkwardly, trying to ignore the chaos while I gritted my teeth, feeling every tentative attempt to make a meal or share a moment together slipping away like grains of sand. On one particularly disastrous evening, Ethan managed to grab a handful of mashed potatoes and fling them across the table, where they landed squarely in my dad's lap. Instead of mortification or an apology, Lisa just laughed it off, throwing her head back like this mess was some kind of comedy show. I snapped. "He needs boundaries, Lisa. You can't just let him act however he likes." Her laughter immediately turned into a glare as she shot back. "Really? Is that how you treat your kids? With such high expectations?" The accusation struck deep. I could feel my heart rate quicken, each beat echoing my growing frustration. So, after that night, or should I say debacle, I made a decision. I would stop inviting her until she could either parent her son or keep her opinions about how I raise my kids to herself. At first, it felt empowering, a way to reclaim my sanity, but then she began to retaliate, posting veiled messages on social media about the burden of judgment and family forgiveness. I felt a twinge of guilt each time I saw those whispers online, but my resolve was firm, like a wall against the tidal wave of her emotional blackmail. Weeks turned into months, and I convinced myself that I was the adult in the room, enforcing a boundary that had desperately needed reinforcing. But the longer I kept her at bay, the more I could feel something dark unraveling, like an uninvited guest finally revealing their true nature. I would wake up panicking some nights after dreaming of Ethan, screaming in a distorted version of my face, his laughter turning hollow as if he was mocking me for trying to carve out my sanctity. Then, one day, a message popped up on my phone. It was Lisa, a simple plea, "Can we talk? I miss you." I was caught off guard, my heart cautiously optimistic. Maybe she understood. Maybe this time would be different. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop, the space buzzing with life, but the air between us felt suffocatingly thick. As she fidgeted with her cup, I braced myself, ready to hear her new understanding of parenthood or, at the very least, some acknowledgement of our strained relationship. Instead, she exploded, "You think you're better than me because you get to dictate who I can bring around? Ethan is my son, and he'll be how he wants to be, just like I will." I was taken aback by her intensity, like staring into a storm brewing on the horizon. My mind raced, thoughts tangled up as I fought the urge to defend myself. "I'm not better, Lisa. I'm just trying to make sure our family dinners don't feel like a war zone. I need you to step up." Instead of a resolution, we only escalated, voices raised until people were glancing over, expressions of concern flickering across their faces. In that moment, it was like the earth beneath me split open, revealing something dark and twisted, years of resentment, envy, and a complete misunderstanding of what family meant. The coffee shop felt stifling, too warm, too bright, and when she abruptly stood, throwing her half-empty cup on the table and storming out, I felt like I had broken something precious and irreversible. Days turned into weeks, and the silence hung heavily in the air, permeating my every thought until even my kids began to notice my despondence. One night, while tucking my son into bed, I overheard them whispering about how Aunt Lisa didn't love us anymore. Their innocent whispers pricked me, forcing me to face the nature of my estrangement. It was a pattern, a wound we were both festering that seemed impossible to stitch back together. The turning point came in the form of a phone call. It was my mother on the other end, sounding distraught. "It's Lisa. She's not doing well," she breathed heavily. I felt my stomach churn, a deep pit forming as I heard the cracks of her voice. It turned out Ethan had been caught stealing from a store, and in a fit of despair, he had lashed out at his mom, claiming that she never cared. The lines continued to blur, the good, the bad, my choices, her choices, and the children caught in the crossfire. Later that same day, I stood outside their apartment, the familiar knocking on the door filled with a weight I wasn't sure I could lift. When Lisa finally opened up, her eyes were red, and her cheeks streaked with tears. I expected anger or confusion, perhaps even a breath of pride in her parenting. Instead, she crumpled at the sight of me, relentless anguish welling up in her gaze as she fell into my arms. "I'm failing, and I don't know how to fix this." Those words hung heavy in the air, laced in heartbreak and desperation. In that moment, I realized that we weren't just fighting over dinner invitations, we were wrestling with our fears and insecurities as parents. And as I held her, my heart began to soften. We began a long conversation that felt like a true reckoning. Those dinners we had both associated with chaos transformed into a healing ground, a space for vulnerability and support rather than the judgment we had projected onto one another. It took time, but soon enough, laughter replaced the tension, and while Ethan's antics didn't disappear entirely, resilience threaded its way back into our family fabric. I learned that sometimes, letting go of boundaries doesn't mean accepting chaos but inviting each other to grow and learn within that chaos, and maybe, just maybe, love would find its way back to our table one meal at a time.